During the 3 years of the Korean War, U.S. Navy and Marine aircraft flew 276,000 combat sorties, dropped 177,000 tons of bombs, and expended 272,000 rockets. Naval and Marine aircraft completed action sorties that rose in number from less than 10% during World War II to more than 30% during the Korean War. June 25, 1950, the Korean War began when North Korea invaded South Korea. June 27, President Truman announced that he had ordered sea and air forces in the Far East to give support and cover to the South Koreans. During a meeting later that night, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution calling upon all its members to assist the South Koreans to repel the North Korean invasion. June 30, President Truman authorized the Air Force to bomb military targets in North Korea, the use of Army ground troops in action to support South Korean forces, and a naval blockade of the entire Korean coast. July 3, U.S. carrier aircraft went into action during the Korean War. Valley Forge CV-45 with CVG-5 embarked, the only operational U.S. carrier in the Western Pacific when the war began, and British carrier Triumph, R-16, operating in the Yellow Sea with Ferry Firefly FR-1s and Supermarine Seafire FR-47s of numbers 827 and 800 squadrons, respectively, launched strikes on North Korean airfields, supply lines, and transportation facilities in the area of Pyongyang. These raids marked the baptism of fire for F-9 F-3 Panthers and AD Skyraiders. Navy pilots also recorded their initial kills in aerial combat during the Korean War, and the first by Navy jets. Lieutenant Plog and Ensign Brown of VF-51 piloted 2 F-9 F-3s and shot down 2 enemy Yak-9P Franks over Pyongyang. July 12, Naval Air, Japan, was formed in Tokyo to provide an interim staff to administer the expanding aviation forces in the Far East. On August 9, the command was established as Fleet Air, Japan, Rear Admiral Henderson commanding. July 18, after a brief respite, Valley Forge CV-45 and British carrier Triumph R-16 returned to action with strikes on North Korean airfields, railroads, and factories at Hamhung, Hungnam, Numpyeong, and Wonsan. Their aircraft heavily damaged the oil refinery at Wonsan. For the remainder of the month, carrier aircraft flew interdiction strikes deep behind enemy lines and close support missions as required, while the ships shifted entirely around the peninsula from the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea in operations intended to relieve the pressure on UN troops retreating toward Busan, South Korea. July 19, Ensign Stevens of VA-55 was shot down in an AD-4 Skyraider during a strafing run in Gangneung-in, North Korea. He was the first naval aviator lost in action during the Korean War. July 22, Badoeng Strait CVE-116, with elements of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing embarked, arrived at Yokosuka, Japan. 4 days later, Sicily CVE-118 arrived at that port with a load of ammunition, and on August 1, Philippine Sea CV-47 reported to Commander 7th Fleet at Buckner Bay, Okinawa. These arrivals marked the first carrier reinforcements to Valley Forge CV-45 in Far Eastern waters and the beginning of carrier deployments to the Korean War that by the war's end totaled 11 attack, 1 light, and 5 escort carriers sent into action. Some of these carriers fought through 2 or 3 tours. July 23, Boxer CV-21, with a load of 145 USAF North American P-51 Mustangs and 6 L-5 Sentinels, 19 Navy aircraft, 1,012 passengers, and 2,000 tons of additional cargo arrived in Yokosuka, Japan. This delivery of urgently needed reinforcements for the fighting in Korea was made by breaking all existing records for a Pacific crossing in 8 days, 16 hours from NAS Alameda, California, to Yokosuka. July 27, to meet the requirements of supporting combat forces in the Korea War, Fleet Logistic Air Wing, Pacific, was established as a unit of the Pacific Fleet and independently from the existing Fleet Logistic Air Wing. August 3, HO-3S-1S and OY-2 Sentinels of VMO-6 began Korean War operations in support of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade in the vicinity of Changwon. During their first day in battle, the helicopters delivered rations and water to troops on a mountain and evacuated men felled by the severe heat. August 3, VMF 214, operating from Sicily CVE-118 while she sailed in Tsushima Strait, began the combat operations of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing in the Korean War with a rocket and incendiary bomb attack on North Korean troops at Jinju. Badoeng Strait CVE-116, with VMF 323 embarked, joined the action 3 days later. Marine squadrons flew close air support from light and escort carriers that logged 12 deployments during the war. August 5, Valley Forge in Philippine Sea began almost 3 years of continuous fast carrier operations with attacks on enemy lines of communication in southwestern Korea and close support missions for UN troops holding the perimeter around Pusan. August 21, aircraft flying from Valley Forge in Philippine Sea indicated the escalation of the air war when they set new records for operations, completing 202 sorties in a day over the Pyongyang area of North Korea. September 6, Leyte CV-32 sailed from the Atlantic Fleet and arrived in the Korean War theater on October 9. September 15, Task Force 90 sailed through a narrow channel and landed the 1st Marine Division at Incheon. Aircraft and naval gunfire supported the leading Marines as they seized fortified Woolmi Island. The landing craft regrouped and incurred a delay of about 12 hours to ensure that the treacherous tide again became favorable, and the Marines followed up with an assault of the mainland. British carrier Triumph operating with the blockade and covering force provided air defense for the assault forces en route, and Boxer CV-21 arrived on D-Day. Through October 3, carrier aircraft flew close air support missions and strikes against enemy lines of communication to support the advance inland. The success of the landings changed the course of the war. September 19, 2 days after troops had fought their way inland from Incheon and captured the airfield at Kimpo, South Korea, the first elements of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing arrived from Japan. Early the next morning, the Marine aircraft began air operations from there with strikes to support Allied columns advancing on Seoul. October 10, carriers moved into action off the east coast of Korea and launched strikes and sweeps from Chungjin to Wonsan in preparation for amphibious landings at Wonsan. A heavy concentration of mines in the harbor delayed the scheduled landings, and the naval attack shifted northward and inland to assist the push of UN forces. When troops landed on October 26, the inland advance had swept past the intended objective area toward the Yalu River. October 29, the fast carrier force retired to Sasebo, Japan, because the advance of UN forces toward the Yalu River reduced the enemy-held area in Korea into which aircraft could attack. November 6, United Nations forces approached the China-North Korean border along the Yalu River. On October 19, 12 Chinese divisions began to cross the Yalu from Manchuria, and several days later clashed with American and South Korean troops before deceptively withdrawing. As enemy opposition thus stiffened, the fast carriers returned on this date to attack targets in their assigned area east of the 127th meridian. 2 days later, the carriers received the primary mission of cutting off Chinese communist reinforcements from Manchuria by destroying the international bridges across the Yalu River. Political considerations restricted UN aircraft from pursuing communist aircraft across the river into Chinese territory to avoid escalating the war to embroil the Soviets. These restrictions frustrated the Allies and allowed enemy aircraft to escape retribution in what became a safe haven. November 9, aircraft made the initial strikes against the bridges crossing the Yalu River at Sinuiju, North Korea. Lieutenant Commander William T. Amen, commanding officer of VF-111, led F-9F-2B Panthers that covered the strike force of F-4U Corsairs and AD Sky Raiders. At least 5 MiG-15 Fagots flying from the sanctuary of Antong, Manchuria, counterattacked. The battle swirled from just above ground level up to 18,000 feet, and Amen shot down a MiG-15 to make the Navy's first MiG and jet-on-jet kill. The Sky Raiders scored 3 direct hits and 5 near misses on the bridges during the first strike, and scored 4 hits with 2,000-pound bombs on the railroad bridge at Manpajan. All the attackers returned despite heavy and accurate enemy ground fire. November 18, carriers launched a strike at the bridge at Sinuiju, North Korea, to cut the communist supply lines across the Yalu River. 12 MiG-15 Faggots jumped the strike group of VF-54F4U-4BS as the Corsairs rendezvoused at 31,000 feet with their high-cover F-9F2 and F-9F3 Panthers. Lieutenant Commander Lam, VF-52 commanding officer, and Lieutenant Parker flew 2 Panthers and downed a jet, both shared, while Ensign Weber of VF-31 flying another Panther shot down a second MiG-15. Meanwhile, the Corsairs attacked the anti-aircraft guns with 500-pound proximity-fused bombs, which facilitated an attack on the bridge by the AD Skyraiders of VA-55. November 29, within days of their offensive, the Chinese tore gaps in the Allied lines, smashing through the South Korean troops, and then attacked the exposed flanks of the U.S. soldiers and Marines, especially in the rugged mountains northwest of Chosin Reservoir. Their drive sent the UN troops into a retreat through the onset of winter. The crisis required a shift of emphasis in fast carrier operations from bridge strikes to close air support, which intensified through December to cover the retreat toward East Coast ports and the evacuation of the troops and civilian refugees by ships. November 30, Naval Aviation flew 6,725 Korean War sorties during November. 2,728 by heavy carriers, 583 by escort carriers, 473 by naval non-carrier aircraft, and 2,941 by Marines ashore. 6 aircraft were lost to enemy action and 27 operationally. December 4, Ensign Jesse Brown of VF-31, the first African American to complete the Navy's basic flight training program for pilot qualification and to be designated a naval aviator, embarked on board Leyte CV-32, flew a close support mission in an F-4U-4 Corsair over Hagaruri, North Korea. Anti-aircraft fire struck the Corsair and he made an emergency landing beyond Chosin. As darkness approached and the temperature fell, his wingman, Lieutenant Thomas J. Hudner, deliberately crash-landed nearby and attempted to pull Brown from the burning wreck. With the buckled fuselage trapping the pilot's legs, Hudner packed snow around Brown to protect him from the flames and returned to his aircraft to radio for a rescue helicopter. An HO-3S-1 flown by First Lieutenant Ward, USMC, of VMO-6 responded, and after repeated unsuccessful attempts to free Brown, had to leave him with the onset of nightfall. Brown died and Ward rescued Hudner, who subsequently received the Medal of Honor. December 6, 5 days after her return from Korean waters, Valley Forge sailed under emergency orders to return to the war from San Diego, California. December 6, Chinese troops redoubled their attacks on retreating Marines in North Korea. 18 VMF-214 F-4U-4B Corsairs struck the enemy with rockets and proximity-fused 500-pound bombs, but the Chinese rallied. Commander Epes, VF-33 commanding officer, led 8 F-4U-4s that made repeated strafing and napalm runs on the enemy. December 7, the advance of Communist forces required the evacuation of airfields in North Korea. Without an additional break in flying close air support operations, the F-4U-4 Corsairs of VMF-214 flew from Yonpo and landed on board Sicily CVE-118 off Hungnam. December 9, after 12 days of fighting, the Marines retreating from Chosin linked up with other UN troops at Chinonganai. December 10, Task Force 90 began to evacuate troops and refugees from Hungnam, North Korea. In 2 weeks, ships rescued 105,000 American and South Korean troops, and 91,000 civilians who had fled the pursuing communists. The vessels also loaded 350,000 tons of supplies. Naval aircraft supplemented Allied types that covered the withdrawal and delayed the onslaught of Chinese and North Korean columns. Following the evacuation of the last survivors, troops destroyed the harbor facilities with demolition charges to prevent their use by the enemy. December 17, Bataan CVL-29, with VMF-212 embarked, joined forces in the Sea of Japan that protected the evacuation of troops and refugees from Hungnam and other North Korean ports. Bataan was pressed into service after her delivery of replacement aircraft to Japan, and her embarked F-4U-4 Corsairs had been evacuated from Yonpo earlier in the month. December 18, VP-892 began operations from Iwakuni, Japan, as the first all-reserve squadron to operate in the Korean War. December 31. In December, Naval Aviation flew 6,781 Korean War sorties, 3,630 by heavy carriers, 1,470 by escort carriers, 535 by naval non-carrier aircraft, and 1,146 by Marines ashore. Enemy action claimed 16 aircraft and accidents 32 others.